Hello, I'm Dr. Paul Cleveland with Boundary Stone, and been talking about socialism and how socialist ideas have been promoted in the United States through the progressive movement that began in the late 19th century and has just kind of been pushing through the 20th century and is just embedded today in the minds of most people. One of the things, and I mentioned the 16th Amendment and the 17th Amendment in my last talk with you. Today I'd like to focus in on the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913 when Woodrow Wilson was elected president. This was the other area of socialist ideas. Socialists have always had an interest in trying to control money and banking. And it's quite simple why they would want to do so. If they can just print up money or in some particular way or tax people without knowing that they're being taxed, then they can really control what it is that they're doing. And they can also extract wealth from them without ever passing a piece of legislation through just money inflation. And think about this for a moment. Prior to the creation of the Federal Reserve, banks could go into banking and issue their own notes. Now, in the U.S., we did have a standard in the Constitution, and that standard defined what a dollar was in terms of the amount of gold or silver it could be redeemed for. One of the problems with having a bimetallic standard is this, that there's no real reason why any two commodities should always exchange at the same rate. And so that had created problems for us. There was also another problem here, is that any bank of issue that was issuing paper dollars, if they were disreputable, they can engage in fractional reserve banking and issue more paper than they held in metal deposits. Now, this is just simply financial fraud to do so, but time and time again, governments throughout the world have participated in such financial fraud, as have some private bankers. Now, in a free market situation, if you had a reputable bank and a disreputable bank, and the reputable bank is collecting the notes of the disreputable bank, at some point they would demand redemption and they would put the disreputable bank out of business. That really never happened in the U.S. because we never really had a free market in banking, because banks in the early days were state chartered and they were funding the state governments. And when this practice led to a bank on the verge of a liquidity crisis, the state would intervene and bail the bank out. And so that goes on over and over and over again. Well, in 1913, what we basically did is we just created the Federal Reserve, which was a monopoly of money and banking in the United States, and put it all under the control of the Federal Reserve. And so at this point, we could practice federal fractional reserve banking really with impunity. Well, not really with impunity. And what they were doing then in the right after, to finance the World War I, is creating a lot of credit money. And that led to a boom in agriculture, but after the war, agriculture kind of boomed because produce could be sold in Europe, where destruction was everywhere. Now, eventually, agriculture would return in Europe, and that market would tend to go away. But having created all this credit money, there were numerous investments made in agriculture that just were never going to really pay off. And so there was a bust in 1920 and 21. But at that time, under the tutelage of authorities at that point, there was a cut in spending, and also a cut in taxes. And what that allowed the economy to do is to stabilize fairly quickly and allow capital to liquidate to its highest valued use. Well, in the latter part of the 1920s, we go through another credit expansion. This one really hit in financial markets where people were buying up securities and on margin. In other words, they're utilizing debt to buy more securities, thus driving the price up and leveraging those prices way beyond their economic fundamentals. Eventually, that's got to crash, and in fact, it did crash, and we all know about this in 1929 when it crashed. And at that point, what you would need to do is you would need to cut spending and cut taxing, because the real problem is the Federal Reserve was allowing the federal government to be irresponsible, purely and simply to be fiscally irresponsible in a way in which they shouldn't be, and also to deceive private businesses into thinking that certain capital investments were better than they really were. So you got to let that liquidate. That's the only way out, and the faster it liquidates, the better you recover, and the faster you recover. Well, that's not what happened at this point. I mentioned this in the last lecture I gave, that what happened here was the Herbert Hoover administration just doubled down. They engaged in all sorts of new spending projects, public works types things, and of course those didn't work. They just sucked up scarce capital that was out there and put that capital to inefficient uses. And then that with the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which brought international trade collapsing, that when trade collapses down, then wealth collapses down, and it's even tighter. And so this is what is taking place at this point, is the collapse of this sort of trade. And so things are getting worse. Well, then in 1932, we have the election of Franklin Roosevelt. Well, Roosevelt, if Hoover was bad, Roosevelt was even worse. In fact, he goes in and with the Banking Act, he confiscates everyone's gold, and he takes us off the gold standard monetarily, and we move into a fractional reserve banking system. And this is just going to allow greater federal irresponsibility in spending and taxing, because now you can kick a can down the road a long, long way through easy money and easy credit. I mean, you think about it for a moment. The dollar, the most common understanding of what the U.S. dollar was actually comes from a German word, Thaler. And what the Thaler was 1 ounce of silver. That's what it was, a note that you could redeem for 1 ounce of silver. In fact, we had that in the U.S. Any of you who have silver dollars set aside, you can see it. And so a $1 note, or $1 paper note, you could have taken that down at one point down to a bank, and you could have traded that dollar note in for a 1 ounce silver coin, a silver dollar. That's what it was. Half dollar, half ounce silver coin. Quarter ounce silver coin. Of course, not true today. It takes many more dollars to get a silver dollar today than in, say, 1910. And so we've been on this path now of the destruction of the dollar for a very long time. And this always has ramifications. It's creating a periodic, what appears to be a boom in the economy that cannot be sustained, and then is later busted. And so we have this fiction. We go through this in a lot more detail in some of our other books, like Basic Economics. We really get into the thick of this. But this is an important piece for our government because it's allowed them to adopt many more of their progressive socialist ideas and fund them through money inflation. Hope this is helpful in understanding some of what has been going on politically in our world today. Talk to you next time.